Thanks everyone for joining us tonight on this call. We are kicking off a year-long robust community process that will significantly increase the potential and the opportunity for additional housing of all kinds in Arlington. I'm Claire Ricker. I am the new Director of Planning and Community Development. This is the 17th. That marks the last day of my second month, and tomorrow will be the first day of my third month here on the job. Everybody has been wonderful. Thank you all for such a warm welcome. It's been quite an experience getting up to speed. There's a lot of stuff going on in Arlington, and this is, obviously one of the many things we're looking to do in the next year. Also with me tonight is Kelly Lina, my indefatigable Deputy Director, and Senior Planner Marisa Lau. So we're here tonight to talk about MBTA Communities. I'm just going to give kind of a welcome and an overview. MBTA Communities is a state initiative that came out of the Housing Choice Bill of 2020. Sometimes that's called the Economic Development Legislation of 2020, in order to address the housing inventory crisis in Eastern Massachusetts. Some have said this is a housing affordability crisis. And indeed, Massachusetts is currently ranked 4th in the nation for home value and 4th in the nation for average 2-bedroom rent. So does this mean that Massachusetts is just expensive? Is this a housing affordability crisis? No. A generation ago, in 1980, Massachusetts was right in the middle of all the states in terms of affordability. If you bought a house in Massachusetts in 1980, you were paying about the national average. Why? Because from 1960 to 1990, Massachusetts permitted and built over 900,000 housing units of all kinds: single family, triple-decker, apartment, condos, all kinds, 900,000 units. From 1990 to today, in the last 30 years, we've permitted 490,000 units, which is about half of what we had built in the previous 30 years. Why? Because development of multifamily housing in Massachusetts is subject to unpredictable and time-consuming processes, either via a special permit process, required zoning changes, or even 40B, which was supposed to streamline development of housing, including deed-restricted affordable housing. Our constraints are administrative. The #1 highest home value in the nation is in Hawaii. Their constraints are spatial. They're an island. Between 2015 and 2017, only 14% of multifamily that was built in Greater Boston, and Arlington's part of Greater Boston, was done by right, meaning no special process. You present your project, and if it meets the conditions of the zoning, you build your project. And so this is the intent of the state's MBTA Communities legislation, to incentivize towns and cities to adopt a policy that will allow multifamily by right, and this is MBTA Communities. DPCD presented the initial guidelines to the ARB last February and the Select Board last March, and made a second presentation to the ARB on September 12th, once the state had finalized its guidelines for this in August. We will make this presentation as many times as is reasonably requested. We want to make sure that people are crystal clear on the facts and the purpose of this legislation. So for some ground rules, we will have the chat open for your questions and comments, and we will use we'll answer as many questions as we can, and incorporate questions and comments into an ongoing live frequently asked questions document, which we will intend to update frequently throughout this year-long process. Interpersonal discussion between attendees should happen privately in a separate chat. Please be polite. And so without further ado, I turn this over to Kelly to present where we are with MBTA Communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. And I'm so excited to see this many people here tonight to kind of help us kick off the first conversation at a first public meeting about MBTA Communities. So this meeting is the first in what's going to be many to outline the requirements of MBTA Communities, where we're going to start listening to you, start discussing some options. And over the next year, these discussions are going to evolve. So right now, we don't have a plan. We're here to listen. Over the next year, we're going to be working with a working group, with MBTA Communities working group, and working with the community, doing a lot of outreach to make sure that we're hearing what you have to say about where multifamily housing, the right location for multifamily housing is in Arlington, and then coming back to you with several scenarios, and then a final recommendation for town meeting, for a special town meeting in the fall. So tonight, this is an overview of our agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about some what this meeting is about, what our meeting objectives are. We'll dive into the legislation and DHCD guidelines, and then talk a little bit about why compliance matters. I'll describe the overall planning timeline, and we'll present some initial organizing concepts for locating our district, and then we'll have some Q&A. We're aiming to wrap by 8:30. The only reason for that is because I have a hard stop with a babysitter, so no offense. So overall tonight, just organizing meeting objectives. After tonight, we really hope that you'll understand the general basics of Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 48, Section 3A. That's MBTA Communities legislation. We also hope you'll understand kind of how the DHCD guidelines apply specifically to Arlington. The DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, has issued a 17-page guidance document. We're trying to cut through that tonight and really focus exclusively on how it applies to Arlington. We're not talking about other communities here, it's just Arlington. We want to describe as well what's at stake if we do or don't comply within certain timelines. And then talk a little bit about the planning process timeline. We want you to understand when we, and by we, I mean the MBTA Communities Working Group, is going to be comprised of resident volunteers. We want residents talking to residents here. Also, it'll be staff in the Department of Planning and Community Development and our technical consultants. We're going to need to rely on some technical consultants for writing the technical zoning here. But we really want to make sure that you understand when we're going to be reaching out to you to ask for your feedback and your comments. I think the most important thing is that we want you to understand that we are here to listen. We have not come to this meeting with a plan that we're trying to present to you right now. We may have some, I do have some general ideas, some lines on a map that I'm going to be showing later, but this is not a plan. This is really for getting your feedback. We want to start a conversation about zoning for multifamily housing and where the appropriate location is in Arlington. As Claire mentioned earlier, questions and comments are welcome in the chat. Note that there's just 3 staff here, so we may not be able to respond in the moment. But please feel free to post those there, and we'll be using that information as well as questions and answers later on in order to develop an FAQ that we'll be posting to the town website. Keep in mind, we don't have all the answers. This is brand new legislation. We have not, we're working with communities all across Massachusetts to try to understand how the legislation works. And we'll be working with you to try to understand what it means for Arlington. So if you have questions and we don't have an answer today, we're going to work to try to figure out what that answer is and get back to you. But please bear with us. Have some patience. We're trying to figure this out alongside you. I think most importantly, we really would appreciate if everyone here could approach this process with an open mind. Really want people to be curious. And Arlington, I've been in Arlington for 4 years, and I think this is an amazing community with some incredibly intelligent people who have incredible credentials and insane knowledge about their community history. I think if we can all bring that knowledge and that expertise together to find a solution that works for Arlington, I think we'll be able to knock it out of the park. I think there are also ways that we could look at how achieving MBTA communities compliance could also accomplish other goals from other plans, and we could uplift some other values from the community. So let's kind of approach this from a what if perspective and try to figure out what works for us. And I would just really appreciate it if you could bring that spirit of open-mindedness to this conversation. So the legislation, we are essentially here because the state has given us an assignment. It's a requirement to identify an area or multiple areas in town where we can remove some of the barriers to develop multifamily housing. Note that whatever zoning we create as part of this process doesn't require immediate production. It's not going to mean that we're taking down houses or that properties that are currently on parcels are no longer conforming. What it does mean is that we're going to be evaluated on the potential for future housing production. And so the eventual changes that might come out of a zoning amendment are going to be gradual. They're not going to be immediate. we are not alone in this. We are one of 175 communities in Massachusetts that are going through this process, whether we're an adjacent small town through a rapid transit community. And so we're all kind of dealing with this at the same time, or pretty much in lockstep together. And so, you know, we're all trying to figure it out. But I think what that also means is that the solutions that we come up with and that other communities come up with are going to make a big difference, because we're all kind of required to do this together. This is probably the most dense slide you're going to see here. I'm not going to read it all to you. This is Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 48, Section 3A. The important things to note here is that in this legislation, it dictates that we, Arlington, because we're served by MBTA, we need to have at least one district of reasonable size. I'll get into that in a little bit, where multifamily housing is permitted as of right. That means without a special permit. It means to be allowed by right. And that housing can't have age restrictions. It can't be limited to only seniors, or it can't just be a dorm. And it has to be suitable for families with children. So we can't have a number of bedrooms capped in the zoning. It has to have a minimum gross density of 15 units per acre. We'll talk about density later on. Just a warning, we are going to talk about density here. And it's located not more than half a mile from the station, if applicable. And when we talk about the DHCD guidelines, I'll talk a little bit more about what this if applicable means for Arlington. The other thing that the guidance lays out is that the Department of Housing and Community Development has been tasked with creating guidelines to determine how we and other communities identify whether we're in compliance with the legislation. So DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, last December came out with draft guidance. They had a whole process where they heard from people, responded and said, you know, indicated what they agreed with, what they had problems with, and they revised those guidelines and then came back to all of the MBTA communities back in August with revised guidance. So that's kind of what I'm going to focus on next. This revised guidance, there's 4 key components for Arlington in that guidance. So I'm going to just walk through these. And these basically take all of that language that you saw on the last page, and then 17 pages tell us how we can comply with that and what it means for us. So first of all, Arlington, no matter what you might have heard with the draft guidance before, Arlington is now an adjacent community. We had originally been considered a subway community, but because we have less than 100 acres of developable land within a half mile of Alewife Station, we're now considered an adjacent community. That has impacts on this core concept called capacity. Arlington right now has a total of 20,450 housing units. Because we are an adjacent community, our capacity, the capacity in the zoning district that we create as part of MBTA Communities, we have to have a capacity for 2,046 units. This is a core concept, and it's a little bit difficult to explain without kind of going into a few visuals here. So give me a second. By capacity, we mean we aren't talking about housing units on top of what's already there. We're talking about housing units as if there was nothing on the land already. So I think if you want to take a look at this for an example, let's say that we have a zoning district where we have to have the ability to achieve a capacity of 2,046 units. Within that zoning district, there is a parcel and there's a duplex on this parcel. We aren't adding additional units to that parcel. What we are saying is we're treating that parcel as if it is undeveloped right now, and we're evaluating for what could be built there by right under the zoning. It doesn't mean that anything has to be built there by right. It doesn't mean that the existing 2 units are not compliant or they're not conforming. It just means that the capacity for that parcel under the zoning, what could be allowed by right, is 4 units. So again, we're not talking about adding 2,046 units on top of what's already there. We're talking about it as if there isn't anything there right now. Another thing that's explained in the DHCD guidance is what reasonable size is. In section 3A, it says that every MBTA community shall have a district of reasonable size. In Arlington, our reasonable size has been reduced from the standard 50 acres down to 32 acres. This kind of brings out like a kind of a sliding scale of calculus here. If we start doing some math and we say, all right, we have to have a district that's at least 32 acres. And in that 32 acres, we have to have a capacity for 2,046 units. If we take that 2,046 units and we divide it by 32, that gives us a density of almost about 64, 65 dwelling units per acre. That may not be appropriate for Arlington. Another way of looking at it is saying in the MBTA Communities guidance, we have to have a minimum gross density of 15 dwelling units per acre. If we take our capacity of 2,046 units and we divide that by the 15 dwelling unit per acre gross density, that means that we would have to have a district of about 134 acres. So when we start thinking about what the size of our district or our district is going to be, it's really going to come down to what is the appropriate density for Arlington. Again, I think visuals really help when we start to think about this. What we're talking about here is something called missing middle housing. If we had a larger district of where we had a minimum gross density of 15 dwelling units per acre, and let's say that district was 136 acres. We're looking at a density that's more like what you can see on the left side of your screen here. This is kind of like your duplexes, your fourplexes. You're getting closer to 15 dwelling units per acre. If we say all we're going to establish is that 32 acres, that means that in order to get that capacity of 2,046 units, we need to allow for a greater density by right. And that means that we're looking more on this end of the scale here, which is more like triplex or a mid-rise. And that would have to be allowed by right in order to be compliant with MBTA Communities guidance. We have a whole range of options along the middle here. So we can have just one large district, we can have multiple small districts, we can have a large district where we have 15 dwelling units per acre, and in the middle of that district, we could have a higher density district where we have something more, where we allow triplexes by right or multiplexes by right. There's a whole range of opportunities here, but I think what I wanted to show you is what we're really talking about here is not towers, and we're not talking about single family homes. We're talking about housing that's kind of in the middle. It's a little bit more dense than what we have, but it's not downtown Boston. I hope that makes sense. I also want to put, I think sometimes it's also helpful if we take a look at pictures. So when we're thinking about density, 15 dwelling units per acre, I don't know about you, but it doesn't mean anything to me. I have no idea what that means. If you think about a triple decker, we have triple deckers in Arlington. Based on our parcel sizes, those triple deckers will kind of get us, if we allowed triple deckers by right, it would get us a gross density of somewhere between 11 and 30 dwelling units per acre. It's going to depend on your parcel size. As you move to the right on the screen here, you can see it gets more and more dense. So a multiplex building with 5 to 16 units, something like this, would get you a gross density of somewhere between 10 to 50 dwelling units per acre. Again, I think the one thing I want everybody here to know is that these are not towers. These are what we're talking about is missing middle housing. This is housing. We have a lot of housing like this in Arlington right now. The main thing is that we don't allow it by right. And so this is kind of what we're looking to allow by right. Another thing that I think people may not understand from the updated guidance from DHCD is that our district location has been untethered from Alewife. Because we don't have at least 100 acres of developable land within a half-mile radius of Alewife, we aren't required to locate our district within a distance of Alewife anymore. This gives us a whole range of opportunities. It also means that we need to take a long time to work with the community to figure out where the appropriate location for our district or our districts are. So that district, it could be anywhere in town. And we'll talk about that again in a little bit. Before I get into the incentives for compliance, I just want to kind of lay this all out on one page. So again, just to summarize, when Section 3A says we have to have a district of reasonable size, that means we need to have a district that's a minimum of 32 acres. When we talk about multifamily housing by right, we're talking about a building with 3 or more residential dwelling units that are allowed by right. When we say no age restriction or suitable for families with children, that means we can't have senior-only housing. We can't require senior-only housing. Senior housing could be developed by right under that zoning, but we can't say the zoning is only applicable to senior housing. We also can't say only 1 bedroom could be built. That district needs to allow for a gross density of 15 dwelling units per acre. It also has to have the capacity for 2,046 units. And as I mentioned before, that's not on top of what's already there. That's as if there was nothing there right now. And again, we are untethered from this requirement, excuse me, of locating our district by Alewife Station. Our districts do have to be at least 5 contiguous acres. So what DHCD is trying to avoid here is any kind of spot zoning. We can't just say this parcel and this parcel or multifamily. We have to have certain districts. And DHCD does recommend that we locate our district or multiple districts along transit corridors and commercial centers. But again, we're not required to. There's a few additional considerations that are laid out in the guidelines. While we can't require a special permit, we can do site plan review. And site plan review basically allows us to require that a builder or a developer or a homeowner who's looking to convert their home to multifamily housing, that they submit a site plan that identifies parking, landscape, open space. It basically requires that they kind of check off the boxes and demonstrate that they're thinking about how their development or how their redevelopment fits within the community. We can't use site plan review to reject a project, and we can't impose unreasonable requirements, but we can require that they think through these various things and they get site plan approval before they build their project. DHCD recently came out with updated guidance around affordability. We can, with DHCD approval, our inclusionary zoning policy can apply. Just want to note that our inclusionary zoning policy doesn't kick in until we hit 6 units. So per our inclusionary zoning bylaw, if you are developing something with 6 units or more, 15% of those units have to be deed restricted affordable. If all we're allowing under MBTA Communities zoning is 3 units, we're not going to hit that. We're not going to hit that inclusionary zoning threshold. This is a consideration we need to talk about as a community. We also can't require, for local requirements, we can't require multifamily housing to meet higher energy standards than other uses. So we can't impose additional restrictions beyond what's imposed on other developments in town. We also can't require ground floor commercial. We can't require mixed use. We can allow it, but we can't require it. So I think one of the things, just one more thing to add to our list of things that we need to talk with you and with the rest of the community about is, are there any kind of bonuses we want to offer? So for example, do we want to say, if you provide an affordable unit, you can build another story or 2 on top of your existing development? Or if you provide ground floor commercial, you can add another story or 2 of residential. This is going to be up to the community. We want to hear from you and hear what you think about those concepts. I'm going to talk next about why compliance matters, but I think before I do that, I just want to take a break. I know there's some questions in the chat here. If there's any clarifying questions I can help answer right now, let's do that. I don't want to talk about whether or not you agree with the zoning. We'll get into that at the Q&A. But if there's any questions that you have about Section 3A or about the DHCD guidelines, go ahead and raise your hand, or I don't know if Marisa or Claire, if you saw anything on the questions that we can answer right now.
So there were a few questions in the chat that I thought were interesting here. One was Rebecca asked, so if the 2-family by right warrant article had passed at last year's town meeting, would we have met the density requirement, or how close would we have been? Grant Cook, I think correctly said 2 families, not multifamily here. Okay.
Right. Yeah, the even section 3A itself is specific that multifamily means 3 or more dwelling units per three or more dwelling units by right. So 2 units doesn't count, 2 units and 2 accessory dwelling units doesn't count. It has to be 3 or more housing units.
Okay. And then there were some questions about how many acres are in Arlington, but it looks like there are others who are on that.
All right.
About 4,500, it says.
All right. Does anybody else have any clarifying questions before I move on? I know I've been talking a lot. I'm also trying to give myself a break to take some water. ADUs, no, ADUs will not count as a third unit. That's because ADUs aren't considered a separate unit. ADUs are basically tied to the ownership of the property. So those aren't considered a third unit by right. And Carl, I will get to your question in just a second because that is related to compliance. Any other questions real quick? Final call. We have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. Other zoning restrictions for multifamily housing. You know, I think as part of this process, once we get a little bit more into the process, we're going to be talking about setbacks and open space and height and all of that. And so I think the way that we are looking at this right now, and again, it's going to depend on the community conversation, but I think what we're looking at or what might make the most sense is to do an overlay district. In an overlay district, we would have certain guidelines for multifamily housing that could be allowed by right, and that's going to have height and setbacks and all of that kind of open space requirements, et cetera, parking requirements, et cetera. The underlying zoning could still apply. So let's say it's in, let's say the overlay zone touched an a property in the R2. You could still create a 2-family unit there or a 2-family building there. You could still 2-family would still be allowed. You would just have the option of building 3-family by right if you wanted to. So I think as we get further into this, we're going to need to have, once we figure out kind of where the district is going to be, then I think we can have more conversations about what does housing on that district look like. So I just, Elizabeth, I hope that kind of responds to your question there. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Let's see here. Everyone see that? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, so compliance. Oh, where am I? I have notes and I haven't been looking at them. All right, so we know that there are a lot of opinions. I've been working for the town for 4 years. I know that there are a lot of different opinions with regard to density, with regard to housing, with regard to multifamily housing, with regard to zoning in Arlington. I'm almost a little bit nervous talking about density. I sometimes feel like if I say the D word, I have to put a quarter in the swear jar. But we can't talk about multifamily. We can't talk about MBTA communities without talking about density. And we can't talk about MBTA communities without talking about zoning change. So I think we need to get comfortable with those ideas. That said, we are going to have disagreements about what this district could look like. And I'm sure there are even people who don't think we should comply. We have, as Claire mentioned, we've presented this to the select board and to the ARB, several times. The message that we are receiving is that compliance is important. So we're moving forward with this planning process under the assumption that we are going to work with the community to create a zoning amendment that responds to what the community tells us they want, but is also compliant with MBTA communities. So I just want to state that right up front. We're also aiming to communicate this process to town meeting members. We want town meeting members to know what we're hearing from their constituents in their precinct, and to make sure that they understand that we're talking to their precinct members. And so when it comes to town meeting, these things are all connected. And also to help town meeting members, I'm anticipating that there will probably be precinct meetings next fall or next late summer, to make sure that town meeting members know how to talk about this as well. So again, this is where I think there's a huge communication and outreach effort that needs to go on as part of this. And we're committed to this process. Compliance matters for many reasons. First is because there are financial incentives. So there's certain grant programs that we would remain eligible for by having compliant zoning. The key program that I think is most applicable to Arlington here is the MassWorks infrastructure program. I know Claire has a lot of experience in MassWorks. MassWorks provides grants for major infrastructure projects. And it's usually tied to these infrastructure projects. When you apply for a MassWorks grant, they're usually tied to the development of multifamily housing, and they're tied to economic development. So when you apply for a MassWorks grant, they kind of want to see how it's connected to housing and how it's connected to commercial and economic development in your municipality. We recently, I'm very excited. I don't know if you saw the news, but we did receive a MassWorks grant recently for in the amount of $300,000, which is considered a small MassWorks grant, but it's for completing the design of Mass Ave and Appleton, the safety improvement project. We are going to be applying for future MassWorks funding for that project. MassWorks grants can sometimes range up to $20 million or maybe even more. When we apply for a MassWorks grant for the construction of Mass Ave and Appleton, that MassWorks grant could be 3 to 5 million or maybe a little bit more. I don't know, prices keep rising. Who knows how much it's going to be. Claire, do you have anything to add to that?
I think there's one more thing I'd like to point out about the MassWorks infrastructure program. And that is that in terms of getting something done, it is the fastest way for a city or town to build infrastructure. Were we to do a design, 25% design, and go through the Mass DOT Transportation Improvement Program process, it could be a decade or more before we are able to get the work done that so urgently needs to be done. And I'm thinking specifically about the intersection at Mass Ave and Appleton, a very dangerous intersection on the way to the middle school. And that project needs to get done. We were awarded $300,000 to do the design. This is sort of a precursor to us applying next year, hopefully, for construction funding, which would mean that we would get this project underway in about 2 years. Whereas if we had to go through the Mass DOT process, it could be so long that it wouldn't even matter anymore, whether we did the project or not.
Thank you. So again, I think MassWorks is probably the biggest grant program that we would be at risk of losing eligibility for. I think the other thing that we are starting to see from the state, and I'll provide an example of this in just a second, is that the state may be looking to require compliance with MBTA communities in order to maintain eligibility for other programs. The example I'm talking about with this is the Massachusetts Clean Energy Law pilot program. So under this pilot program, we need to have a zoning amendment, or we need to have MBTA compliant zoning by January of 2024 in order to participate in the fossil fuel ban. I'm going to take a step back a second. Not everybody knows about the fossil fuel ban pilot program, but I just want to kind of describe why this is important. So in the fall of 2020, town meeting members, 92% of town meeting members, there was an overwhelming approval of Article 5, which is the fossil fuel ban. This was a home rule petition to allow the town to restrict connections to fossil fuel infrastructure in new buildings and major renovation. This is a key step in advancing advancing toward our net zero goals of net zero by 2050. Buildings are one of the major producers of CFCs. Why am I blanking? So I've got a lot of words in my head, of carbon emissions. And so if we are able to restrict connections to fossil fuel, we're able to make major steps toward our climate goals. However, because it's a home rule position, we need the state to enable us, to give us the right to basically follow that legislation and to enact those policies. Governor Baker in August kind of gave us a little bit of a carrot, and he signed a new climate bill into law. And that bill says that if Arlington can meet a stated inclusionary housing policy by January of 2024, then we can participate in that fossil fuel ban, and we can participate in the pilot program to advance our climate goals. The inclusionary housing policies that we have to meet one of two policies. The first one, we're not going to be able to meet. That would require that 10% of our total housing units are on the subsidized housing inventory. Right now, Arlington is at 6.54%. We're not going to get to 10% by January of 2024. The other option is that we are compliant with MBTA communities. And so if we are able to adopt zoning that allows multifamily by right on at least 32 acres in town, maybe more, at a gross density of 15 acres or more, then we will be able to participate in this fossil fuel ban, and we'll be able to take steps toward our net zero goals. There's a whole other host of reasons why compliance matters. We have a number of planning initiatives that have established goals that are around housing, not sometimes specifically about multifamily, about MBTA communities, sometimes just more broadly about multifamily housing and housing choice, sometimes about locating additional housing density by transportation corridors and reducing the use of single occupancy vehicles. So if we do comply with MBTA communities, we're able to better access a whole host of services, work destinations. We're able to provide housing that's closer to the places that we go every day. We can increase the demand for locally serving retail. It helps us to fill vacant storefronts. When we have more people around a specific commercial location, it creates more demand for that location. In tandem with the fossil fuel ban, it will also reduce our reliance on single occupancy vehicles, because if we are able to locate this district around bus stops or transit locations, it encourages more people to take transit instead of driving. It also, more broadly, if more communities adopt MBTA communities zoning, that means that there are fewer people who are driving through Arlington to get somewhere else, because their housing will be located around transportation, around alternative forms of transportation. So I think it's not just about Arlington, but it's about achieving goals to confront the climate crisis more broadly in Eastern Massachusetts. And ultimately, it also provides housing choice. We have empty nesters in Arlington who want to downsize, but we don't have a lot of places for them to do that. We have people who have adult children who would like to move to town, but there aren't really enough apartments or locations for first-time homeowners to purchase a home. People have different preferences now regarding their first-time home ownership opportunities, and maybe they don't want a single-family home, and that multifamily unit may be providing that kind of option for them. So compliance matters in a whole host of ways. We talked a little bit about the timeline. Right now, we're in November. Check your calendars. We are in the process of creating a working group. And over the course of this winter, we're really entering a period of outreach, engagement, and listening. As Claire said at the beginning, we're willing to do this meeting more time. We have 40 people here right now. We want more people to understand this. We're recording it. We're going to put it on the website. But I think if you have a board or a commission or a neighborhood group and you want us to kind of walk through this presentation, we can also revise this presentation. This is the first time we're giving it, so we can tweak it if it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But we want to make sure that people understand the basics of MBTA communities and what we're looking to do as we move toward next fall. We're going to be coming back to the community with a survey and a feedback form so that we can understand what people want to hear. And we're going to be submitting an action plan to the state so that we can continue our compliance. With the working group next spring, we're hoping to work with a consultant so that we can come back to the community probably sometime in May with a couple of options. And these options will reflect what we have heard from you at this public meeting, at future public meetings, and we'll be proposing a couple of scenarios, all of which will be compliant with MBTA community requirements. Throughout the summer, after we present those scenarios, we're going to be refining those. So we're going to be going through another period of listening and revising, and kind of working toward a single recommendation. And in the late summer of next year, we'll bring that recommendation back to the community, make a few final tweaks, and then we'll be working toward the process of filing a warrant article, getting this ready for the redevelopment board review, and then bringing it into a special town meeting in the fall. Our immediate next step, as I mentioned, we're putting together this working group. There's a link down here at the bottom. We'll try to get a news article out, or try to get some information out via our town email tomorrow. We're inviting people to apply to be on the working group. We're going to have 2 ARB members on the working group. We're hoping to have 1 to 3 residents, preferably individuals who have zoning, planning, or housing experience. We're also looking for a resident who's got experience with communications and PR. I am a planner. This means, and I work with zoning. This means I'm a nerd, and this means that I'm often not understood. And I really think it's important that when we are communicating with residents about this, that we have a filter and we have somebody who knocks us over the head and says, no, you're not making any sense to the average person. So we'd love to have somebody in this working group who has experience with communication and PR and can tell us to stop being zoning wonks. We'll also be working with our DEI engagement coordinator, Teresa Marzilli. She's agreed to be on this project, and so she can help us make sure that we're reaching out to communities who don't typically respond to public forums and public feedback. And again, we're going to have DHCD staff who are supporting this initiative. Other immediate next steps is working on communications, a townwide survey and comment form, getting a place on the town website where people can go to find out what's going on with this, and where we can post things like the video for this meeting or our slides. And we'll create an FAQ, and this will be a living document, so we'll try to keep updating this as we get more questions from the community. We'll be working with the working group to get approval for an action plan. We need to submit an action plan to DHCD to ensure ongoing compliance by January 31 of next year. The action plan is actually a pretty simple document, but it basically lays out, here's what we're going to do, here's the public meetings we're going to have, here's who we're going to be reaching out to, and here's the here's our schedule for compliance. So it's basically just telling them, hey, we're committed to doing this, and here's our plan for doing so. So finally, I mentioned earlier in this meeting, we didn't come to this meeting with a plan, but we did want to present some concept for feedback. This whole planning process is going to be a conversation about what our multifamily priorities are. So when we think about MBTA communities and we think about a district or multiple districts, there's different things we need to balance. So do we want to spread this district or multiple districts across town or around different open spaces, schools, or services? Or do we want to create a denser district that's focused in one particular area? What do we want to allow by right? Do we want to allow 3 families by right, 6 families by right in order to trigger our inclusionary zoning bylaw? Or do we want to allow more housing by right? It's really going to depend what we hear from the community. What other goals can we achieve through MBTA compliance? How do we balance the need to preserve our commercial and industrial spaces? Or do we want to incentivize mixed use and then think about neighborhoods serving commercial? I think there's a lot of values that we need to have discussions about with the community, and we're hoping that you'll help us have these conversations. With that in mind, we've mapped out, put some lines on a map, and again, these are not plans. We're kind of making ourselves vulnerable here, so please be gentle, but we also want to hear your initial gut reactions. Everything you see in green here is a park or an open space. Let me be totally clear, we are not looking to develop our parks and open space. Absolutely, it's not up for consideration. We're also not looking to create houseboats on water. But if somebody wants to come up with a way to do that, let us know, but that's not really part of what we're looking to do here. These are basically organizing principles for discussion, or maybe some provocations. Some of them may be a little bit wonky. But when we think about multifamily districts and we think about density, I think one of the first places that people go to is thinking about adding that density along Mass Ave or Broadway. I think it's where we've talked about zoning changes in the past. It's where people kind of immediately go to when we think about this. One consideration is that everything in purple here is our industrial zone, and everything in red or pink is our business district. Because we can allow mixed use, but we can't require it. We may want to have a community conversation about, like, what do we do to preserve our commercial if multifamily is allowed by right? So do we exempt industrial and business parcels from an overlay district? Or do we create incentives for doing mixed use? Again, this is really going to be up to the community. Another option would be kind of setting a district back from those corridors. So it's more of like a buffer district on each side of the commercial corridors. So the commercial corridors would be preserved, and then we would allow for a little bit more density on either side of that. We could move away from the corridors entirely. What if we had little neighborhood clusters all throughout town, and then we allowed little tiny sub-districts in the middle for neighborhoods living commercial? When I think about this, I think about like this area here over in Broadway where there's a bakery, there's a bodega, there's I think there's a laundromat, there's a veterinarian, and there's a dance studio and a yoga studio. And it's right in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Is that something we want to encourage? And is MBTA Communities the right zoning vehicle? Or is it the right vehicle for kind of achieving something like that if that's what the community wants? Again, up for discussion with the community. Maybe we want to move away from thinking about vehicle corridors entirely. What if we create a district that is adjacent to multi-use paths? So maybe our district could be located somewhere along the Minuteman Bikeway, or if we think about the Minuteman Bikeway, maybe we also include the Mystic River Path and the Alewife Path. Obviously, we want to stay away from wetlands, and we want to be careful about locating our district in any areas that are prone to flooding. But I think this is another way we could think about it, about encouraging alternative transportation instead of just vehicles. It is MBTA community zoning, so maybe we think about locating our district somewhere around bus stops. How could we encourage additional bus ridership and try to strengthen our bus service, and maybe even create such a demand that we get increased frequency? That could be an option. Another thing we could do is maybe instead of just locating it around bus stops, locate it somewhere along bus lines. This would open up opportunities for thinking about districts closer to Route 2, or thinking about districts that go through other parts of town that aren't really related to our commercial corridors. And then finally, I did say this at the beginning, we are not looking to develop our open space. Preserving our open space and parks is critical, but with that in mind, could the districts be located in the residential areas that are around our parks and open space, so that we're providing more equitable access to those parks and open spaces? This would be another option for the community to consider, and we'd love to hear your feedback on this. So again, these are just some different things that we can weigh in the balance as we talk about MBTA community zoning. And we really just want to hear what you have to say about it. So I think with that in mind, it is 7:51. I mentioned I am available till 8:30, so I'm happy to stick around. I would love to hear what people think, whether talking in the chat or want to raise some questions or just have a discussion here. So Rebecca? Oh, you're on.
And do you need myself? Okay.
There you are.
Button. Sorry. So one of your questions was, do we make it 6-unit by right, 3-unit by right? Does it have to be the same throughout, or could, for example, Mass Ave and Broadway be 6-unit by right, Pleasant Street, other bus routes be 4-unit or 3-unit? Or is that just too complicated to have it be different?
One of the things that we have heard from DHCD is that we can have sub-districts. So, you know, we could have more than one overlay district. We could have a district within that district where there's a little bit more density, and then a kind of a buffer around it where there's a little bit less density. I think we have a lot of options here. Sometimes simpler is better. Our zoning bylaw is very complicated. So I think in a way, making it straightforward may be helpful. But I think, again, it's like, it may be something that one of the things we could consider is having a higher density along the corridors. And then as you move back from the corridors, have something a little bit less dense. That's basically what we call in planning. We refer to that as a transect. So it's all up for consideration at this point. Jennifer?
Hi, yes. So first I want to say how excited I am about this conversation that we're having. The fact that we, along with 174 other communities, sort of have a little stick to do the right thing, I think is we should see this as an opportunity to really sort of think about what kind of town we want to become, or what kind of town we want to not become. You know, look at our current trends, look at what we want to do. So I'm very excited about it. I'll just express a worry I have. We have a lot of housing needs, and I worry that if we put everything into this basket, we might end up creating a proposal that is too complex, is not something that local builders want to sort of meet. And a proposal is, I would love to see maybe two proposals, one in the fall of 2023, one in MTBA proposal, which is directed at missing middle housing, which I think is sort of the intention of it. So units that are, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 in size, and then potentially an affordable housing overlay district that we just do because we want to. Like, we shouldn't try to do just the bare minimum. We should really think about what are the housing needs that we have in Arlington and try to propose something that fits those needs. But I wonder if maybe we can separate those things out, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Absolutely. I think that's I think that's a really good question. I think that's a conversation we need to have, because when we think about our inclusionary zoning and how you need to have 6 units in order to trigger inclusionary zoning, it doesn't seem like MBTA Communities requirement at a density that may be appropriate for Arlington would necessarily result in housing that triggered it. Those may be two conversations that we either want to move together at the same time or separate out. That's something I think working with the Affordable Housing Trust to understand, you know, are those things that we could advance at the same time? How would we have those conversations, and how would we kind of piece them apart so it's not too complicated? I think that's all important things to consider. But thank you for your comment. Sue?
Hi, I have two kind of clarification questions. I'm thinking other people may not know either. One is, what is an overlay district? And then the more complicated one is, we're going to set up districts, but you're saying we don't have to build on them now. When we don't have a lot of open space in town, when would buildings be built there? Would in the future, when something's sold and torn down, or you see what I'm asking?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll take that question, and then I'll pass the overlay question over to Claire, because I think she has a lot more experience with overlays than I do. That's all good. So the first one, the second question about when would buildings be made. Arlington is a redeveloping community. We aren't a community. We're not like Billerica or something further out where there's vacant land. We're not even like Lowell. Claire can tell you that. Where we have properties that are sort of vacant and waiting for development.
Right.
What we see in Arlington is we see redevelopment. So basically what happens is when the land becomes sufficiently valuable, or somebody sells their property, somebody who buys that property may want to do something different with it. And so they either demolish what's on the lot or they do an addition in order to allow something different. So our zoning, the overlay zoning, doesn't require any development. And that's why I mentioned earlier in the presentation that it doesn't mean that we're going to see a ton of things happen all at once. Change would happen as properties change hands, or as a property owner may decide that they want to do something different with their property. Does that kind of help to clarify your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but again, change would not be required. It just means that you would be allowed to do something different than what you could currently do right now. Claire, do you want to explain what an overlay district is?
Sure. So I think, we could start with the assumption that we have the Arlington rule book that governs our zoning. And we have what we'd like to do is do something different than what's allowed in our zoning over certain finite jurisdictional areas. This is not the entire town of Arlington. These are areas that are planned to achieve a goal. So when we figured out, hey, here's what we want to do with our MBTA communities, here's the location we think it will work, or locations, I think, that's all up for discussion. We would write a zoning bylaw, and we would probably call it MBTA Communities Overlay or something better, which would allow you to achieve more than the underlying zoning. And this initial overlay, we were talking about an affordable housing overlay, we were talking about a number of different things. This initial overlay will be simply a matter of the 32 or more acres with 15 or more dwelling units allowed by right. So if you were to build in that area and you were to buy a house or a building or something and raise it, you could build the exact same house or building or what's currently allowed under zoning. Totally. Go in, do your application. Here you go build your project. Were you also subject to the overlay, you could say, you know what? I don't want to build the same thing that was there. I want to build this other thing that I'm allowed to build because I am in a finite jurisdictional area that allows me to achieve goals more than the original zoning.
Thank
so
you.
It's like super
Very
zoning.
clear.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Carl?
Thank you. I think it's an excellent presentation, and thank you, Kelly, and everybody in the planning department who's put it together and made it so informative. There are a couple of points I wanted to make and maybe a question to put out for the future. In these 174 communities that are being affected by this, it's not all hunky-dory that this is going through. In fact, there's been a lot of pushback, and there is talk that communities like ours, if we can stall, may get a much better deal by stalling from the whole State House project. So I think we should really look into, in addition to if we comply, what are all the good things, or how do we comply in the best way for Arlingtonians, but also what is plan B or plan C? What is a non-compliance like, and what would it cost us, or what would be possibly a good thing there? Or if we stall and hang out with the big kids who are already putting up their communities to a defense that gets them a better deal for everybody. And by that, I mean a better deal for affordability, a better deal for climate resiliency, a better deal for the way the community wants to have self-control. That could be good for us. So we shouldn't just go into this like we have to say yes to it, because there is a cost to saying yes and there's a cost to saying no, and we should know that. The point I guess I'd also ask you to make is that I don't think I heard about this except thanks to Len Diggins, who mentioned it yesterday. I'm a town meeting member in Precinct 15. I would hope that all the town meeting members are really involved in this, or at least aware of it very well. And I would especially hope that any people that bought or rent in the areas that might be considered for these density overlays would have a huge say in it and certainly be aware of it. I don't think I live in that part of town, but I used to. and I had a single family and a 2-family zone. If I knew I was buying into a zone that could have 6-floor buildings or could have a huge amount of units per square acre instead of the single and 2-family, that would really be something I'd want to know about before it goes through, and I'd want to have a say in it. And finally, I mentioned it in the chat, it's frustrating with this MBTA density overlay because Arlington is being punished for doing its job to provide density. We're the second most dense town. I think we're the third largest town by population in the state, and we're at 17 units per acre already. We're only disallowed from being moving to the next level of being compliant because it doesn't allow for single or 2-family units. It says you only count 3-family and up, which I think is very unfair. And I actually hope that the MBTA will change before this is finalized. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Carl. I just will mention, I think what we said before is that, you know, we have 40-something people here tonight, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. This is a presentation that we are definitely open to having multiple times. I know this week in November may be a little bit hard for people to attend. And if you have a group or if you have a way of connecting with other people that we could share this presentation with and have this discussion with, we definitely want to do this. And once we get the working group together, doing that additional community outreach to make sure that people are aware of what's going on is really a priority here. And this is part of why we are planning almost a year-long planning process, because we want to make sure that people know what's being discussed and that they're able to be part of the conversation if they want to be. So thank you. Alex?
Can you talk a little bit more about the contiguous versus not contiguous preference in the guidelines? Because some of the maps you showed had non-contiguous things, but I thought earlier you talked that there was a preference for contiguous areas. And I was specifically thinking of, you know, could we allow fourplexes by right on 6,000 square foot corner lots across town that maintained, you know, dimensional uniformity with the surrounding community, but at the same time spread this around town?
Sure. So the preference in the guidelines is that we have a district. It's not that we do something that applies to specific size parcels. The district could be as small as 5 acres. Can't be any smaller than that. So we could have, you know, 25-acre districts. And they could be located around town, but they have to be at least 5 acres. And part of the reason is that because DHCD doesn't want us to say, all right, we're going to do this on the Russell Common parking lot, and that's it. I mean, we could include the Russell Common parking lot. No, it may not be the appropriate use of the Russell Common parking lot. But I think that's where with this requirement, it has to be somewhat contiguous. And I think the other thing just to note is, you know, I showed this map. A lot of the districts that would result of any of the from any of those lines in the map are a lot bigger than what we would be required to have, but they're really just starting points for discussion. And I think we would narrow in on those as we work with the community.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Meta?
Hi, yeah, my name is Meta. I'm an architect. I have also studied urban planning for my entire life, seems like. And I'm also a builder and a developer doing multifamily housing. And I'm so excited about this. This is really I'm excited about this, not as a developer, but as a planner, because this is really a once in a lifetime opportunity. It is not often that zoning is changed in a meaningful way. And it has not changed in a meaningful way in a very, very long time. And I think your presentation was excellent, making the point about how there's been just such a reduction in the amount of housing units that have been built in the last 30 years. And I can tell you as a builder that it is dang near impossible to build anything anywhere around here. So I am very much looking forward to participating in this conversation. I think this is super important and meaningful, and I am 100% you know, in support of complying with this. I think it is absolutely the right thing to do in terms of equity, in terms of the environment, in terms of housing and affordability all across the board. So anyway, just want to say hooray.
Great, thank you. Pat?
Hi, I'm sorry. I had to unmute myself. I had a couple of points that I wanted to make. First of all, I think that we should not be regarding this as if it were some sort of a contract where the state is offering us, if we only do this, we can get certain advantages later on in terms of grants or whatever. This is a legislative mandate. This is like saying you have to drive on the right side of the street. It may very well be that the penalties for driving on the wrong side of the street are not strong enough to get you to do what you're supposed to do. But this isn't a matter of saying, look, if you're willing to pay the price, the left side of the street is just fine, and let's go do that. So I hope that we don't find ourselves into the sort of transactional thing where this is not an obligation. It is simply a request and we could turn it down. And DHCD has been very, very clear that it does not regard it as a request and that you can't turn it down. And if they don't have enough sanctions now to persuade you to do what you are required to do, then don't be sure that they won't develop sanctions later on. So I think we should just start with the idea that we're going to comply with this and that we're not going to thumb our nose at the law any more than we would thumb our nose at any other law. Secondly, I have a pretty strong feeling, maybe it's because I've been doing planning things for a pretty long time, and am imbued with the notion that we really ought to be concentrating our development in transportation corridors where we can get higher densities and where we can minimize the amount of disruption and all of the side effects that automobile transportation involves. And we do have Broadway and Massachusetts Avenue. And there are, and this is sort of an important point, there are lots of opportunities for redevelopment along those corridors. One of them is coming up right now where a couple are being consolidated for a housing development under 40B. And I'm on the Zoning Board of Appeals, and I'm not ready to say I either like this or don't like this, but it's an example of what can be done in terms of redevelopment. That doesn't necessarily mean McMansions and R0 zones. It can mean developing condominiums in what may be two parcels, it may be 4 parcels or 5 parcels. Consolidation is a helpful thing. But I would like to have us focus on that because of all of the various side benefits that come from consolidating our development along those corridors. And I think that we could do that and at the same time address the problems with commercial development we have in order to achieve both. I don't think that that is something that is not possible. To do. And I think that if we were able to do that, we would be able to continue the process that led us to be, as Carl points out, a highly dense community. Almost all of that density was built before our current zoning ordinance. And it was in order to stop that we adopted the current zoning ordinance. So let's be a little cautious and humble about taking credit for all of that density. We've been against it now for the last 30 or 40 years, and it's time for us to learn that that may have been a misstep in our community development, and maybe we ought to concentrate on fixing that today.
Thank you, Pat. And I will note that, as we said earlier in this presentation, we did hear from the Select Board and the Redevelopment Board that compliance is critical. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we are going forward with the intent that we will prepare zoning that is compliant. Obviously, it'd be great if we could create zoning that's not only compliant, but also achieves or advances goals of other plans. And so that's going to be a task that the MBTA Communities Working Group is going to be looking at. Is like, how can we both achieve compliance and how can we achieve goals from other plans and projects? So thank you for your comment. Len?
Thank you, Kelly. You actually said me what I was going to say, which is a repetition of what was said earlier. I mean, my first inclination is to agree with Pat about the concentration, but I mean, we do have the Fair Housing Action Plan, the Age-Friendly Dementia Plan, and the Net Zero Action Plan, and the Connect Arlington Plan. And so it would be really good to see all of those plans kind of folded into this process. And I really appreciate me reaching out to the community and listening to our input, but you all have a lot of expertise, a lot of knowledge. And so I would like to see you take what we say, but also use your expertise to then tell us, or give us some scenarios, maybe various plans, that say, this is how we can achieve more than one objective, in various scenarios, and then give us that, to ponder. So, but this is great, and I share the excitement of Meta, earlier. It's like, this is great. And so, I love this kind of, deliberative process with the community. So I'm excited. Thank you.
Thanks, Len.
Thank you, Len. I also want to acknowledge, I want to appreciate, thank you, Len, and I know Eric Helmuth is here as well. I just want to thank our select board members for taking the time out of their night to join and participate in this meeting. So thank you very much.
Welcome.
Alan?
Hi, thank you. Since I'm on the finance committee, I'm always trying to stare down our structural deficit and the looming overrides and all of that. So, I can imagine that various scenarios to achieve compliance could have different positive and negative financial impacts in terms of, on the one hand, increased school capacity and increased services. On the other hand, new growth and the opportunity to, get multiple grants and things like that. But my real question is, how much should the financial impact be considered in the evaluation of the different scenarios and different alternatives to achieve compliance?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a really good question. I think that's something that comes up with a lot of planning initiatives. I do know that I think like we mentioned before, Arlington is redeveloping. So it's not going to be like there's a sudden onslaught of new development that would occur as part of this. The one other thing I do want to note that I have heard in DHCD discussions is that the number of children in multifamily dwellings is typically a lot lower than the number of children that reside in single family homes. And so we do see a little bit of a difference when we're looking at housing in multifamily versus housing in single family. One of the things I would love to do is to work more closely with with FinCom and with I know the Fiscal Resources working group of Envision Arlington to really understand. I think there's a lot of discussion in town around commercial development versus residential development. And we would love to know, it would be super helpful for our department if we could know what is the tipping point? Like what is the, what's the amount of commercial development that FinCom and just the town's financial departments needs to see in order for the idea of residential development to not be something that is triggering too many conversations about burden on schools and that sort of thing. If we knew what the goal was, we could create economic development plans that would help us work toward those goals for getting a different split of commercial versus residential. We haven't been able to get that answer yet. So if you could help us identify a goal, that would be incredibly helpful. The other thing I would love to do, if this is something you could help us do, is to talk with FinCom about MBTA Communities so we can have kind of a more nuanced conversation about the potential fiscal impact, because I think I'd love to hear more from FinCom early in the process than later on when we're presenting actual zoning. I want to know what those impacts are. So please, if you're able to reach out and we could schedule something, please do so. I'd love to have that conversation.
Sure, happy to help.
Great,
Definitely.
thank you.
Great, thank you.
Steve? Oh, I can't hear you.
Steve, are you on mute?
The audio switch is not cooperating with me. I just wanted to say with the with the number of the existing plans that we have, housing production plan, sustainable transportation plan, and so on. There are a lot of elements in those that I think would be useful building blocks in achieving compliance. And I think it's this is a really exciting opportunity for us to do some of the things that we've been talking about doing for quite a while. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anyone else here? I haven't had a chance to really see anything, to read through the chat. I've been responding to questions from people with their hands raised, but any other questions from anyone here or comments? Matthew.
Hi, I just had a quick question. So in terms of mixed use development, I know we allow that currently in our commercial zones, but it's by special permit, not by right. So currently, potential housing development in commercial zones wouldn't count towards the district, correct?
I mean, again, like what's developed isn't what's counted. What's counted is like,
no, like if you took a commercial lot and said like we could potentially develop, under the mixed use bylaw, this many housing units could potentially be
no, because
incorporated.
that wouldn't. It's not allowed by right. It's through a special permit under environmental design review. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I'm just kind of scanning through here, see if there's anything in the chat here. We've got a comment about considering north-south arteries as well. I do think that's a good thing to consider. I know there's that through the bus network redesign, there's a proposal to extend, blanking on the route, but all the way up to through Belmont Center. And then there's also the 80 bus that goes to the West Medford commuter rail station. So I think looking at some of those east, everything's on an angle in Arlington. So some of those north-south arteries is something worth considering. I think Park Ave as well. Yeah, I do think Jennifer had noted about what can be built and what can't be built by right. I think the only thing that can be built on any parcel in town by right is a single family home. I may be wrong about probably not in the open space district or the industrial district, but in pretty much every other in the B5 zoning district or highest density commercial district, you could still build a single family home by right, but you cannot build a 3-family house or a triple decker by right in the 3-family zone. So I think one of the things that we may want to consider looking at as a town is what's allowed by right in various districts, and if a district is named for something, should that thing be allowed by right or not? I think that's a good conversation to have. Again, I'm just trying to. Yeah, I'm sorry if I miss anything in the chat. As I mentioned before, we will, we'll be downloading the chat. We'll be posting this video to the town website and trying to make sure that we put together an FAQ that responds to any questions. I think one of the questions I heard tonight, which is an excellent question, is what is an overlay district? Because I think that's something that we don't have any like detailed overlay districts in our zoning right now. A lot of other communities do have them. So it's something new to Arlington, and I think it's something that we need to explain. Any other last minute questions? We got a few minutes left. Otherwise, I think we can wrap this up. I really want to thank everyone for your time and attention tonight. I'm very sincere in our offer to give this presentation to whatever groups or committees or neighborhood organizations or whatever want to kind of be in the loop on the discussions around MBTA communities. These are very important conversations to have. And I think the more people we can talk with and the more people we can hear from in considering multifamily and where it's most appropriate in Arlington, I think the better response we're going to have. So thank you all for your time. If you have any comments or you want to reach out, please send me an email. If you go to arlingtonma.gov/planning, you can find Claire's contact, Maurice's contact, my contact information on our website. I know, Claire, you probably have something else you want to wrap up.
No,
with.
I was just going to say, Kelly, did we mention that we would be looking for expressions of interest to join the working group? And there should be a way that you could submit, just a very short email indicating your interest
Yes.
on the website.
Hang on, let me post that right in the chat.
Great.
And I'm sorry, I'm sure people already logged off, but we'll be trying to get this out via town email. So if you are interested in being in the working group, we're right at the top of the committee openings page. Please send Claire a note to let her know that you're interested. Maybe describe a little bit of your interest in this process and your experience in planning or housing or anything else, or public relations to help us. We need interpreters. So, yeah, please let us know if you're interested.
Great.
Claire, is there anything you want to wrap up with?
No, I don't think so. I thank you all for coming. Again, we'd love to answer any questions you have. We will deliver this presentation as many times as needed, as Kelly has said, as I have said. Very interested in getting the facts out there, and I really appreciate the enthusiasm this evening. This is an exciting time. This is a real opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to this process and working with you all.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Good night.